Ready to talk about Alfred Hitchcock?
I am very ready.
I know you've done way more little behind the scenes. You've done way more prep work than I have. I was just like, hey, let's just talk about Hitchcock. And you're like, I'm watching all these movies. And I'm like, you're better than I am.
I think you've seen more of his movies than me, though, so I was making up for that.
Making up for that. What movies did you watch? I know you told me yesterday.
Um,
I don't remember.
I tried watching The Man Who Knew Too Much, the 56 version, but
Okay.
I honestly didn't really like that one all that much.
That's
Um,
I couldn't agree more. I liked the first one. Is the first one with Jimmy Stewart or is it the second one? I'm on
the
Google
second
right now.
one,
The
the
second
the
one's
first
with
one
Jimmy
has
Stewart.
Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre?
Yeah,
Peter Lorre.
I love Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre is great. What's the other one that there's another one of his that I just couldn't get into. It's supposed to be, I'm looking, Shadow of a Doubt. That's another one that is like highly regarded, and I just like it just dragged for me. It totally dragged.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's a lot like a lot of his other movies. Hitchcock definitely had certain themes that kind of carry through a lot of his work.
Right.
So that's one you can kind of dip out on and just watch a different one and get pretty much the same gist.
I had told you I'd seen all of his movies after 1950, which is true, but then I found two movies this morning that I had not seen: The Trouble with Harry and The Wrong Man. I've never seen
Okay,
either one of those films.
I love The Trouble with Harry.
What's that
That
about?
so it's a comedy that I would say is kind of in the vein of like Clue or Who Framed Roger Rabbit, more so Clue. So it's basically this gentleman dies and they he gets buried and they keep digging him up because different people keep thinking they're the person who killed him and they're trying to figure out who actually did it of them and they're trying to hide this from the police simultaneously. So they keep burying him and then digging him back up and burying him again as soon as another person comes into the story who may have been the person who killed him. It's pretty humorous.
That
I would
movie
say that's
sounds
probably
hilarious.
it's great. I would say it's probably his only like true like comedy piece.
Sure. And that, like, now that's something that I wouldn't mind Hollywood remaking for the modern era. That could work. That actually could work in today's society. We're just kind of like running down the movies before we get into them. So for me, all right, so I guess we'll just get into it. So how did you get into Hitchcock? Like originally, like how old were you when you first saw your first like Hitchcock movie that you remember at least? What's your backstory with Hitch?
Well, let's see. I think I saw Psycho. I mean, I was in elementary school for sure, probably like second or first grade. Um, and who doesn't love Psycho? That's probably where most people come into Hitchcock, as that's probably one of the most iconic movies ever made.
Oh, for sure.
And I mean, even as like a, I don't know, 7, 8 year old kid, I thought that was just like the coolest movie. And I have continued to think that way, for the next 20 years. And I doubt I'll ever not think that. I mean, that movie is absolutely amazing.
100%.
And
The
then
score itself, the opening title sequence. If that was the whole movie, I'd still think it's one of the greatest films ever made.
I think Sal Bass did his opening title sequence for that movie, as well as for a lot of his later movies, kind of
And
starting with Vertigo. What?
Bernard Herrmann did the score to Psycho, right?
Yeah, Bernard Herrmann did the score. I'm talking about the art for the opening credit.
Oh,
I
sure.
think was
Yeah.
Saul Bass. He did a lot of those. Actually, Saul Bass did the artwork for Anatomy of a Murder. So for the longest time, I actually thought that was a Hitchcock movie when it's not, just because it looked like his other ones.
You are the only other person that I've ever spoken with that has ever seen Anatomy of a Murder.
Oh,
Wow,
really?
that's a deep cut. I have not like, well, no, I mean, how often does that movie get brought up? I mean, I'm sure I know other people that have seen it, but I remember watching that on VHS tape in like fifth grade, and like that was such a dope movie. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm gonna have to rewatch that. It's been far too long. So
Or I was gonna say, have you seen the Psycho sequels?
yeah, so I was just gonna say, I mean, I get where Ryan's coming from. here's the deal. The reason they made the Psycho sequels was purely for money, because if you look at it, there was a 20-year gap between 1 and 2. And what was
Yeah.
really popular in the early 80s? Slasher movies. Because in 1978's Halloween, that reinvigorated the slasher film into modern cinema. And then you had, Friday the 13th, right? So for Universal to capitalize on that and bring in Anthony Perkins, who probably wasn't up to much else at the time, makes sense, right?
Ouch. Yeah. Well, for three and four, those were kind of, or three was directed by Perkins, and at that point, he really wanted to continue
Sure.
doing them.
Well, of course he did.
And then
That's what he was
four,
famous
he already
for.
knew he was sick. So,
Oh, he was sick? I didn't know that backstory. Now
he had I know he was HIV positive. I think at that point he had AIDS.
Oh, wow.
And at that point,
Okay.
that was a death sentence for sure. So,
Yeah, 100%. And then the Gus Van Sant, that's who directed the 98 remake, right? With
yeah.
Vaughn and H.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting art piece because it's pretty much a shot-for-shot remake of the original. I don't know what they were going for. To be honest, I've seen the movie once.
Yeah, I have to.
What do you know about it?
The story is Gus Van Sant said that Psycho is a perfect movie, so he wanted to remake it as a shot-for-shot remake to prove you can't remake this movie.
Oh, so he did it just to like stoke the fire.
That's what he says. That's what he says.
I love it.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. So I started watching Bates Motel during the second season. One of my best friends, Joe, he's, he likes movies, but like, he's not like, he doesn't like rip them apart like I do. And he told me, he goes, you got to watch Bates Motel. The first season had just dropped on Netflix after it was done on A&E. He's like, you're going to love it. I'm telling you. So I started watching it. Season 2 was okay. And then like towards the third or fourth season, it kind of dragged. The final season was phenomenal. Have you seen Bates Motel?
Yeah. I really like Bates Motel, as to what the person said. I don't think that like retroactively harms, what Psycho did.
Right.
I mean, Psycho as a movie, it fundamentally changed the landscape of horror films. I don't think anything could take that away from it, let alone its sequels or the TV show. Yeah.
I will, Bates Motel, to me, there's such a separation between a movie that came out in 1960 and a modern day telling of a prequel that came out in the 2010s. Whereas with Hannibal, like those movies still aren't that old. So to continuously, it's almost like the Terminator. It's like they had the Sarah Connor Chronicles series like 10 years ago. And it's like,
yeah,
why are they doing this? Like, why do they need to do all of these things? You know what I mean? Come up with an original idea. But I did like Bates Motel. I thought it was very well done.
yeah, I concur with that. There is a big difference, especially for, I mean, I know Hannibal didn't do this, but when you have the same actors in it, I think that also kind of takes away. But again, I mean, I feel like Psycho kind of stands on its own as its own kind of thing, a little bit removed even from its sequels, and especially from, like as you said, the sort of like prequel retelling that kind of builds to what we see in the movie itself.
Right. And I think it also helps that it's in black and white, because that really separates it from every other thing that's ever been shot that has to do with Norman Bates.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
This is also kind of weird. So the first movie Hitchcock made in color was Rope in 1948. So
oh yeah, we're going to get to Rope today.
Yes. When I was a kid, I mean, 1960, when you're like in elementary school growing up, and like, you're not much older than me. So growing up in the 90s, of course, you think 1960, everything's in black and white still. So it wasn't until I was like older where I was like, wait. So he started doing color, and he purposefully made this film black and white. And I'm assuming that wasn't for any kind of financial reason. I'm assuming that was for a specific aesthetic that he wanted, though I'm not sure.
I think it's also got to do, so to be honest with you, and I'm
sure with the blood probably too, the rating.
There's somebody out there that knows way more about the details of this than either of us, but to go along with your point, I think it was an artistic choice on purpose, purely for the fact that this was a quote unquote like mature R-rated kind of movie at the time. So to shoot the shower scene in general, if that would have been
Yeah.
shot in color, there's no way that would have gotten a pass to have gotten put in the theater. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Scorsese did the same thing when he made Raging Bull. He shot it in black and white for multiple reasons, partially because it takes place, in the 40s and the 50s, right? But then also the way, they use this chocolate syrup mixed with like all this other stuff for all the blood during the boxing sequences because it shows up better on black and white film.
Yeah.
And it's like aesthetically, it's like when Spielberg made Schindler's List, aesthetically it just works. There's really no rhyme or reason. Or Mel Brooks's Young Frankenstein. It just works, All right, so back to topics here. So what's so interesting with Hitchcock was there anything else you wanted to say about Psycho?
Well, I was going to say this is actually kind of a generalization, not necessarily Psycho. So
no, go for
Hitchcock didn't like write his scripts. He wasn't like a storyteller in that way. He bought rights to books, like Psycho is a book, or to plays, or to scripts that had already been written. And then he was a storyteller in what was on screen. So there are a lot of yes, there was a lot of people who have gone through and analyzed his films maybe a little too much. I'm not saying I'm one of them. But this is something that for Psycho, for instance, there are a lot of analysis regarding what the taxidermied birds mean and like what they're a metaphor for. But I don't think Hitchcock is the type of director who puts stuff on screen as a metaphor. I think he put it there for like Psycho. I think he put it there to kind of foreshadow Norma and to show that Norman Bates was kind of odd, because I don't want to like piss off the taxidermy people, but that's kind of weird. Right. I don't think he put it there for any like deeper reason other than that. I don't.
What are some of the metaphors that people claim were
for that one? Well, okay, for instance, I'm trying to think of what people were talking about with the birds. Well, okay, so a lot of people look at Psycho as being very queer coded. I don't. I think that's just how Anthony Perkins acts, because I've seen him in other movies. I don't see any of that going on as much in that film. Sure. I think he's just supposed to come off as kind of a certain kind of way because of how the book was written, not for anything else. So a lot of people are looking at the birds as kind of representing Norman's sort of identity crisis in that fashion, which I think that's a bit of a reach.
Now that's interesting.
I came up with my own idea for an example. I think the birds represented Norman being trapped and surrounded by death, and at a point in time when his mother was alive. So the birds look alive, they're seemingly alive, but they are, stuffed. They are dead, and yet they are dead and still in a, wide-eyed. Some of the birds look like their wings are spread, they're in positions of life, but they are not. And that's kind of representative of how Norman is kind of stuck. But in reality, again, I think it's just supposed to show that Norman's kind of weird.
He's odd. Right. Yes. No, I mean, I like your take on it. That's very interesting. All right, so moving on from Psycho. I mean, it's pretty much so you watched Psycho when you were in like second grade.
Yeah.
That's fucking crazy. So for me, my quick little intro to Hitchcock was, let's see, I was really into movies as like a 5-year-old. Like I really got into Indiana Jones and Star Wars and all that shit. And then I really got into old movies when I was in 5th grade. I started watching Humphrey Bogart movies on AMC. The African Queen, Maltese Falcon, Big Sleep. And I took a deep dive into, old cinema, old Hollywood. So obviously Hitchcock came along with that. So I was like 10 or 11 when I started really getting into it. And my local video store in town just happened to have a vast Alfred Hitchcock collection. They probably had somewhere between 20 and 30 of his films, and they were all on VHS tape, and they must have come from a collection because they all had like Alfred Hitchcock's like silhouette on the cover, and then like whomever was in the movie. So I just kind of started renting them one by one, and would my parents would know like, oh, Jimmy Stewart's in that one, because like I didn't necessarily know who Jimmy Stewart was yet. So it's like, oh, Jimmy Stewart's like, that would be a good one, or Cary Grant, right? Or whomever. So Psycho was probably like, I don't know, maybe like the 10th Hitchcock movie I saw. I saw Rear Window, Vertigo, The Birds. I saw all of those prior to Psycho, just because of the way I would just go to the video store and just rent different Hitchcock movies. Over the course of a year or two, I watched all of these, and so then as I got older, you start, and I'm sure you're in the same boat. You start having conversations with people, and it's like it's so interesting. A movie like Rope that nobody ever talks about. Rope to me. Rope has all of a sudden in the last few years become one of his more popular films, in my personal opinion, because they always would talk about the main, like, Psycho, The Birds, North by Northwest, Vertigo, Rear Window, Dial M for Murder, right? But Rope would never be in the conversation. But I've noticed in the last few years, I keep having conversations with people, and now Rope is all of a sudden getting brought up all the time. And I think it's because it is a timeless movie that in 2021 is not dated at all and works as a stage play. I mean, you could get high schoolers to perform, this film in a high school theater. You know what I mean?
Well, it's based on a play, so that's
Right.
probably
Well,
why.
yeah, exactly. But it's perfect. It's so fucking good. What are your thoughts on Rope?
So I absolutely love Rope, but it's based on Leopold and Loeb, which I think is a really interesting true crime case. I think there's also kind of a big explosion of people being interested in true crime, so that might have something to do with it. And honestly, I was looking at this, and it kind of occurred to me that Rope is basically the movie Scream, but set in one room.
Ooh, now that's an interesting take.
So, of course, we have a lot of Hitchcock films talk about the perfect murder. Strangers on a Train would be another example where there are people discussing the perfect murder. If you look at Rope, again, a lot of queer coding, which kind of is the same in Scream. Scream, of course, has Billy Loomis. Loomis being like Sam Loomis from Halloween and from Psycho. He, of course, quotes Norman Bates saying, "We all go a little mad sometimes." But really, that movie is taking a lot from Rope, where you have these two young men who are trying to commit the perfect murder. Although in Rope, they're kind of twisting the words from their professor, who's played by Jimmy Stewart. And
they do it in more of like an intellectual way, like almost as a science experiment.
Well, yeah. So they were saying, I think specifically, he says, "You twist my words into a cold, logical excuse for murder." Whereas, they're doing this based on books and theology, whereas Scream did it based on films, the films that came before it, like this one. But it's really kind of the same thing.
Yeah. That's a very interesting. I never really looked at it that way before, but I completely agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think what's great about Rope too is that it's a very short movie. It's less than an hour and a half. Like you get right into it. Opening scene, no spoilers in case you've never seen the movie Rope, but they get right into it. There's no, and that's another thing I love about Hitchcock is that there's not exposition for exposition's sake. It's like sometimes you just get right into the whole thing, or there's just a little bit of an introduction. That way you can get to know the characters, and then boom, they go right into it. And that's what.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. No,
so that's actually a big thing with Rope and with a lot of his movies. Well, Rope, for instance, is shot in 10 takes and it was made to look like it didn't have any cuts. Which is Alfred Hitchcock did a lot of experimentation in his film, which I really like. But with this specific one, that really creates this like building tension and suspense, of course, being the master of suspense. And that really goes along with like the guilty conscience that Farley Granger's character has because of what they do at the beginning of the film. But with this movie and with a lot of Hitchcock movies, actually, we really see a lot of voyeurism and scopophilia. And that is very much introduced in how we come into the movie. Generally speaking, as audience members, we are not just watching. We are active participants. For this case, we are active in the murder that happens at the opening scene of the movie. We are meant to emphasize with the villain. We are not with Jimmy Stewart's character as he's figuring out what's happened. We are with the killers, hoping Jimmy Stewart doesn't figure out what we have done. We're not solving the case with the good guy. We're with the bad guys, which is very, very different than how movies are made today, for sure. I guess that back then that was kind of seen as like a subverting expectation, and that would be considered that today. But that was very, very much how most of his movies were told narratively.
That's an amazing way to put it. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and that's the, and it's like, it's just such a baller movie. Like, the more I think about it, it's just like, I want to go rewatch it. When 1917 came out, what, 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, everybody was like, oh, wow, this is so cool. Like, they made this movie that looks like they never cut anything. And I'm like, yo, you ever seen Rope? Like, you know what I mean? Like, everybody acted like 1917 was this. I mean, it was a great movie. I mean, the plot was fine. I wasn't thrilled with the story, but it looked great. But everybody was like going on and on.
Birdman did that too.
Birdman did it as well. Exactly. Like, it was this like groundbreaking piece of cinema. And it's like, this has been done before. It's just, I just think most people read one news article and, they just run with that.
No, seriously, I think it really had to do with branding. It is kind of a similar thing with Orson Welles. Putting yourself in the movie makes you a household name. And back in those days, that's, what you wanted to be. You wanted to be recognizable because that was going to get you better deals.
100%. And, and I think to go along with that, I think after, we'll get some of these messages real quick, but I think, so once he got into television with, Alfred Hitchcock Presents and the Alfred Hitchcock Hour and stuff, he really entered people's households, and I think him being on camera, doing those introductions or whatever have you, and then popping up in his films, to your point, it's an excellent way to brand himself. But it's almost like the way I look at it is this: it's almost as if Hitchcock is so synonymous within his own films that it's like to have all those movies and him not be in them almost gives you like a different feeling about it. Like, to me, it's like, it's almost like M. Night Shyamalan back in the early to mid 2000s, where it's like he come out with a new movie and you're expecting a twist, right? You're expecting,
and also,
you're going, when's Hitch gonna pop up? When's, what scene is he gonna pop up in, right? Or like Stan Lee,
the same thing for Shyamalan with his cameos.
Right. Well, exactly. Yeah. And then you're also expecting a twist,
Yeah.
And then Stan Lee did the same thing with all the Marvel movies. It's like, well, where's Stan Lee gonna pop up? And it's like I don't think there was anybody before Hitchcock that did it, but it's like he started that trend, and it's become like synonymous with some people.
I was gonna say, I think Orson Welles was doing it kind of side by side in terms of time wise, but also, again, with being a household name, if you have, certain director presents, a lot of people today, especially back then, I'm sure, don't really pay attention to who's directing a movie. I think that's more of a cinephile thing to do. But, I could ask my mom to point out M. Night Shyamalan, and she will, because he was in the movies.
His scene, Shyamalan's scene in, or scenes, I should say, and her scene in Signs, is my favorite.
Definitely.
That was legitimate. Like, this isn't just a director, like, popping up in his own work. That was legitimate acting. Like, for me, it's like, whenever I rewatch Signs, when you get to that scene, you're like, wow, he's really good as this character. You know what I mean? And
also, I like the specific character that he made himself. He made himself the character that caused his character's pain, which is very meta.
The death of his wife. Yeah, no, I mean, it's genius. It's fucking genius.
Well, like I said, it's not really a mystery. That's why I kind of like it, because we're with the killers, which is why I compared earlier. The Trouble with Harry is very much Clue, although I will say Clue does have better writing, as much as I hate to admit that.
Here's the deal. So I saw Clue once on television, I don't know, sometime between age 10 and 13, and was like, this movie's fine. I've never played the board game all the way through. So is that something I should probably go back and rewatch?
In terms of a comedy film, I would say Clue very much ranks there in being not only a good film, but something that's pretty well ingrained in well accepted in like the cultural zeitgeist. I wouldn't even say it's like a cult film. This is a very, very popular film, and legitimately for good reason. It is a very well executed film.
Okay. I'll have to definitely check it out. And I don't know why I'm blanking on the name of it now, but I don't know why I'm blanking on the name of it right now. Knives Out.
Yeah.
Is that similar to Clue, correct? Like a little like little bits, just because of like the investigation and the murder and stuff.
I mean, it's only similar in terms of who done it. Clue is very much a have you seen the Blues Brothers? Oh, imagine the Blues Brothers as a who done it,
but without I have a Blues Brothers poster, buddy.
Okay, so like it's written by the same guy, Max Landis. Or not Max Landis,
yeah.
John Landis.
John Landis.
It's John Landis.
Yeah, John Landis.
Yeah. So he wrote Clue.
Okay.
Didn't direct it though.
Yeah. who directed Clue? Do you know?
Oh, I actually can't remember. Let me.
I'm looking it up right now. You talk.
Then it is
John
John
Landis is
Landis.
great.
I just thought he just wrote it.
So
Yeah.
modern. So to
Yeah.
your point, I don't necessarily know. I mean, other than once again Shyamalan's earlier work, there's not really a director that has been around for 20 years that's like the new Hitchcock. But there are specific films. What was that? Do you remember that Shia LaBeouf movie that came out? I'm blanking on the name of it. I don't know
Disturbia.
why. There you go. I mean, that was very Hitchcockian, you know.
Well, okay, I was going to say for Rear Window, that movie, it didn't invent the distrust your neighbor trope, because I think that's been around since humanity has had neighbors, because who would trust a neighbor? But that movie
Yeah.
is definitely the epitome of the distrust your neighbor trope. And then you get like Disturbia, you get The Burbs, you get Fright Night, which all these movies are so clearly inspired by Rear Window. And you even get like episodes of television, like How I Met Your Mother did a Rear Window episode. Rick and Morty had a funny sequence that was very much Rear Window. And I'm just gonna start talking about Rear Window right now.
Let's get into it, because that's one of my favorite. It's one of Hitchcock's biggest movies, and it's an amazing film.
For sure. Again, it goes into Hitchcock makes the most like voyeuristic scopophilia films, and this one kind of merges like audience, character, and director, because you have Hitchcock as a filmmaker directing the actors, and the actors as the characters watching their neighbors, and you have the audience watching the characters, and it's all this kind of intertwined creep fest, really.
So it's interesting. So when COVID first started, once lockdown first started, I
was going to touch on that.
I was watching a lot of movies at like the first couple of weeks, because like, what the fuck else were we gonna do? And for whatever reason, like on one of my movie collections, on one of the bonus, like one of the fancy channels I get, they had like all the old monster movies, and then they had pretty much the entire Alfred Hitchcock collection. So I didn't watch any movies that I hadn't seen before, other than I did try to rewatch Shadow of a Doubt, and I was like, I still just can't get into this movie. But like, I'd watched, Dracula and Frankenstein. I talked about that on another show last week, but I rewatched Rear Window, and I probably hadn't seen it in, I don't know, maybe since high school. And it holds up. Like, it's Grace Kelly's characters, slightly like, it's very kind of like early 50s, right? But the majority of the movie, it holds up 100%. I mean, even to the ending of it. And it's great. It's Jimmy Stewart just getting inside his head. It's a masterpiece, and he's such a great actor. I mean, Jimmy Stewart really is. He is one of the greats
for sure
that ever was in film history.
Definitely.
Have you seen
it was
the
basically
Christopher Reeve one, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It was fine. I mean, I watched it a long time ago. He was still alive when I watched the movie, but it was fine. I mean, that being said, so sticking with Jimmy Stewart, we're gonna breeze over to Vertigo real quick here.
Oh, okay.
Because that's how me and you got into this whole thing. Like, hey, the next time we do a show, let's talk about Hitchcock. Because we were in a live chat on a different program the other day, and you had made a mention about Vertigo, and I said it was overrated.
How dare you?
So I know.
Dare you?
I know. So let's just get into it. Why do you love Vertigo so much? Where does it rank in the pantheon of Hitchcock movies?
Okay, so this is not just me saying this. This is like the American Film Institute, the German Film Institute. I'm serious. They have ranked this in, top 10 best movies ever made, because it is. This is coming from, like, in any best movies ever made list, this is always near the very top for a reason, because it is one of the best movies ever made. In terms of actual filmmaking, well, okay, hang on. Part of the reason I love it, I adore films that use a color palette, not just for visuals, like a Wes Anderson uses a color palette, and that's nice and pretty, and who doesn't like the pastels? In this movie, these colors are used as part of the story to advance the plot. in this visual medium. And that's so dumb that so many directors don't do that. Noah Hawley very much does that in the TV show Legion, and I absolutely appreciate that. And I think that takes the filmmaking and elevates it in such a way, and it takes the story and elevated it in such a way that's amazing. Further, so I don't know if you're aware, but Hitchcock didn't really like to film in studios. He preferred to film on scene.
Right.
And so the landscape of this film is gorgeous. A lot of it's San Francisco, some of it's down near like Monterey, going towards like Big Sur where the redwoods are and Pebble Beach and all that. And also, okay, so I could get into a whole thing regarding like what this movie is actually about. This is
Get
pretty
into
much
it.
okay, so this is pretty much male gaze the movie. Do you know what male gaze is?
Yes, I agree with that. He's infatuated with yeah, I get it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's this I mean, it's predates Freud and Jean-Paul Sartre, but they did this whole big thing on it, and there's this it's this whole theory in feminism. Hitchcock, very well known for not necessarily treating the women on set very well. I don't know. It's very much reminds me of, oh my God, what's his name? Stanley Kubrick.
Right.
And this
I agree.
movie, this movie is, I love Kim Novak, sorry, can't pronounce her name. She is as once we see her as Judy, not as what was her name, Madeline. Yeah,
Yes, I
Madeline.
believe so.
So once we see her as Judy and not as Madeline, she becomes one of the most realistic women I've ever seen portrayed in film, where she's just not having any of Jimmy Stewart, and then it quickly progresses into this like very toxic and very abusive and possessive relationship that's all about ownership and stripping her of her identity to transform her so that she could replace this woman he's lost, who it turns out she also was. Part of me thinks this movie actually could be a little bit, yeah, I do think this movie could be remade, because the only issue, and it lends itself to this, is that everything is going back to the male gaze. Everything is that happens is for Jimmy Stewart's character. So we see the guilt that Judy has over Madeline's death through Jimmy Stewart rather than her own guilt that she has herself. And I would say that's the only issue the film has, is that she lacks any kind of autonomy as a character. Which
Right.
I mean, the movie's about stripping that of her, but I don't know. I don't think that's what Alfred Hitchcock's intention was, which is why I say it's his only issue. So when it goes to like, I guess, spoilers for this old as hell movie, Judy dies. A lot of people kind of write that they think that she died because Jimmy Stewart's character would never love her, which is super dumb. I'm sorry. That's a bad take, man. That's a bad take. First of all, she died because she was surprised, but she lost her life because of her guilt. And the only reason that that's not clear, again, is because we're watching the movie through Jimmy Stewart's lens, not through hers.
Right.
But this movie is eternally deep, super beautiful in terms of, I mean, like all of Hitchcock's films. I mean, this movie is just an art piece to look at, as well as having so much pretty art on screen.
It is. It's visually stunning, and I
yes.
do love the color palette. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so my thoughts, I mean, I completely agree. I think it should be remade. You know, I just compare. I get it. It's a great film. I agree with everything you said. For me, it's just, you know, I'd rather watch, you know, Lifeboat, or which is, I think, very underrated. Or Dial M for Murder. Some of his other films I just rank above Vertigo, but you're completely correct. I believe Anthony Hopkins played Hitchcock in a movie. I saw a movie about Hitchcock
called Hitchcock.
Yeah. And you're completely right. The way he was with women was very similar to Stanley Kubrick. And we'll get into it shortly here. You've seen Marney, correct?
No.
No. Marney, it's with, so Sean Connery's coming off of Dr. No and From Russia with Love. It was the same year Goldfinger came out.
Yeah.
And, you know, it Tippi Hedren's coming off The Birds, right? So
Hmm.
that's a movie that I've been pitching to everybody that I know for about 5 years that needs to be remade, because the response to it was very lukewarm when it came out. And the older the movie gets, the more that time goes by. I also rewatched that when COVID first started last year. It is very dated, and I got where Hitchcock was going at the time with the way it looked and the story he was trying to tell. But in 1964, you could only say so much on
Yeah.
screen, whereas now it would definitely be an R-rated movie, right? So I say all that to say this. Vertigo, I agree, should be remade because you could retell that story in a modern setting. And I think with, the way you're able to just put it all out there on camera, dive a little deeper. And I say the same thing with Marney, and I've been saying this for years. John Hamm would be great as Sean Connery's character from Marney, but that's just my personal thought.
Well, see, I have a whole thing on that. So with Hitchcock, he had like I said, voyeuristic approach to filmmaking, but a lot of his movies had a lot of like espionage, or his earlier movies, like espionage and spy kind of films. So I
Right.
kind of saw like the isolationism for Rear Window kind of going in two different directions. One of which was like the whole cabin fever, which obviously we lived through 2020. So I think we can all understand how boredom kind of lends itself to creativity. And then it gets real weird real fast. And especially since he's not only confined to his apartment, but also to a wheelchair, that must be eternally annoying. But the second way I
Right.
kind of saw it was isolation in terms of country. Rear Window came out in 1954, which is during the Cold War. And there we have this kind of tendency to like distrust the quote other unquote, and then we kind of tend to make like a spectacle and become like fascinated with it, which lends me to just go ahead and PSA: zoos are evil, and you shouldn't go to zoos because animals shouldn't be spectacle, and neither should your neighbors. Yeah.
I know you don't like zoos. I love zoos just because I like to watch animals, but that's a conversation for a different day. That being said, this is this
It's
is this is what I will say. It probably won't happen this week or next week, but I'm going to rewatch Vertigo. I'm going to watch the whole movie, and I'm going to look at it. I'm just going to try and give it another chance. I've seen it twice. I'm going to try and give it another chance.
with
That's
the
what
with saying it could be remade, I was thinking about, did you see the new Invisible Man that came out last year?
I still have not watched it yet. No, like I said, I'm behind. I am very behind on
Oh, well, I
movies.
was gonna say that could really be remade in kind of that vein. I think
Okay.
that movie really lends itself to that sort of psychological look at
And I
the way the world is now.
Right. And I agree with what you were saying earlier, like the kind of the scope of Vertigo, like the way it's all, it's not really like on set or anything.
Mhm.
I think to get the proper director and cinematographer, if they were to attempt to remake that movie, I think would be key in terms of telling the story. 100%.
Oh my gosh, I'm completely blanking on his name. Who is Denis Villeneuve's cinematographer?
Name me one movie. I'm on Google. Give me one movie that he did the cinematography
Prisoner.
for. Prisoner. Oh, Prisoners with Hugh
Yeah,
Jackman and
yeah.
Jake Gyllenhaal. By the way, that is one of the 10 best movies of this past decade for me.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're talking about Roger
100%.
Deakins,
Yes, Roger Deakins.
who
There we
did
go. That's
who did 1917 cinematography.
Yep. He
Yeah.
would be, I think he's perfect for, all movies cinematography, but he would be absolutely phenomenal in
Oh.
doing like a Vertigo.
All right. Let's move
Really good
forward.
movie.
What's your bring up a Hitchcock movie that you love or you hate or you think is overrated, and we'll talk about it. What do you got?
Huh. All right. Well, I'm not the biggest fan of the birds. No real
Me
reason
neither.
why.
It's
Okay,
interesting. Go ahead.
cool.
It's
So, well,
interesting.
first
Yeah,
of all, I
go for it.
don't like birds. I appreciate that they actually, used birds. I think they had to get the birds drunk, which was weird. But
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of horror movies where it's just like animals attacking. There's the frogs, Night of the Lepus, the birds. I think they have one, Strays, which is about cats. This is like a very it's like standard horror movie idea. I don't think The Birds was the first. Tippi Hedren's even in another one, Rar, and you think she would have learned her lesson from The Birds.
So my thing with the birds is simply this. You know, I watched it as a, 11, 12-year-old kid, and it didn't give me nightmares. I mean, it was a scary movie. It was creepy. Don't get me wrong. The next day, I'm in, my mom's car driving down the road, and we see a bunch of pigeons, and it's like, oh, fuck. You know what I mean? Like, watch out. But it just didn't scare me. I think maybe in 1963, it was of the times enough that it was actually a scary movie. But watching it in like, the year 2000, 2001,
Yeah,
at the
I,
time, I'm also watching Whatever Happened to Baby Jane with Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. Now that movie gave me fucking nightmares. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, I would say I don't know. I don't particularly think it held up well. But also that you brought something up that made me think that Alfred Hitchcock's probably remembered very well, mostly for Psycho and The Birds, and those are really his only horror movies for the most part. Everything else is just suspense. And it's funny that,
Yeah,
a horror director isn't, or someone who isn't a horror director is remembered for
as a
these
horror
just
director.
these two horror movies. Yeah, which
Well,
is
and
weird.
you make such great points because it's like, you know, he was definitely, or he is, I should say, definitely, he's the master of suspense, the thrillers, the suspense movies. But to your point, he is definitely in the conversation as one of the greatest, horror directors ever. Yet, most of his movies are, espionage thrillers or movies about isolationism or movies about, love gone wrong or whatever have you. You know, me and you were talking privately yesterday about the Cary Grant films of Hitchcock's, and you
Yeah.
said that they're the least Hitchcockian of, all of his movies. So
Yeah.
why don't we go to that? I'll say to that real quick. So it's 1963, Hitchcock is at the height of his game. He's got television shows, he's coming off of Psycho, right? And North by Northwest, Vertigo. Those were the three movies that came out before The Birds.
Mhm.
And I think it was kind of this idea like, well, what's Hitchcock going to do next? And then he brings the animals in. And it's almost like the movie is so famous because he was so famous at the time, to where it's
Yeah.
like now that so much time has passed, you look back and you go, well, that wasn't one of his best movies. It's just
It's
at the
basically his
time
happening.
it was during the peak golden era of Hitchcock movies. Would you
I
agree
can
with that, Lego?
understand, yeah, I can understand like a modern audience not being as into it or as into his work. For the most part, I do think, quite a few of his films hold up, like his most famous ones, Rear Window, Vertigo, Psycho, Rope. I think these hold up. But again, coming from the point of view of a modern audience, particularly people who like, those big popcorn blockbuster movies, I really don't see this kind of these like slower moving. I wouldn't even say his films are thought provoking. They're just more subdued. Probably wouldn't be as interesting.
Sure, sure. So moving on to the Cary Grant, there's Cary Grant did four films with Hitchcock, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
so let's
You did
let's let's dive
Suspicion,
into
North
that.
by North. Yeah.
What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on the Cary Grant films?
Okay. They're very Cary Grant. I think
I
Cary
know.
Grant kind of overrides Hitchcock. If I didn't know they were Hitchcock going in, I wouldn't have realized they were. Like that wouldn't have like, oh yeah, this is a Hitchcock movie. Like with other movies, you could kind of you can tell. But with these ones, it's like, no, this is a Cary Grant film.
I agree. So other than North by Northwest, all the other ones he's done with Hitchcock, I've only seen once. I've seen North by Northwest, I think 3 times, but you couldn't hit the nail on the head better. It's like there are certain movies. I mean, there's even how do I phrase this? Especially his earlier work before he really started bringing in that star power. You would watch his movies with, some actors that may have been famous at the time, but they're not like Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, like legacy famous level, where
Right.
you're watching them because it's a Hitchcock movie and they're playing characters within the Hitchcock movie. Whereas with Cary Grant, you're watching a Cary Grant movie. It's like Tom Cruise. That's why when people start talking about Tom Cruise should play a Marvel character or Tom Cruise should play this, and it's like, no. Because it's going to take away from the movie because Tom Cruise's star power, he's so uniquely famous in that sense that it's like you're going to see the new Tom Cruise movie. You might not know the title of it. You might not know the character's name unless the character's name is in the title. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I would also
And that's
say that, or go ahead.
no, that's my take with the Cary Grant films with Alfred Hitchcock.
If I can make a comparison.
Yeah.
So Rebecca and Suspicion. Rebecca came out in 1940. Suspicion came out in 1941. Rebecca has Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine. Suspicion has Cary Grant with Joan Fontaine. These are basically the same movie. It's a wife who doesn't trust her husband. Things ensue.
Yep.
Rebecca feels like a Hitchcock movie. Suspicion
And it won
is
Best
a
Picture.
Cary Grant movie. Oh, really?
Right. Yeah,
I think
Rebecca
it just
won Best
was
Picture.
remade on Netflix with Armie Hammer. Yikes.
The new one, I still haven't seen it. Have you seen it?
Not get good reviews.
That's why I didn't watch it. I was so excited about it. I was so thrilled. I'm like, oh, maybe this will like turn like a new Renaissance era and we'll get Hitchcock remakes on Netflix. By the way, it just popped into my head. Do you know who would be amazing? He's got way too many other projects that he's tied up in. But do you know who David Fincher would be? David Fincher, to me, I think, is maybe who can carry a little bit of that Hitchcock legacy. I don't know. I think he would be great. Maybe he would be the person that should remake Vertigo and then get. Do you get what I'm saying? That would be interesting.
I think the only movie I like by him is Zodiac.
Really?
Yeah,
Have you seen the majority of his films? Have you seen
I've seen like the big ones. Fight Club, 7. I couldn't even get through Gone Girl. Couldn't get through Social Network.
I didn't like Gone Girl. Social Network was actually my favorite movie of this past decade, but for so many reasons. I think they should make a sequel to it. But I agree with you on Gone Girl. I've watched it twice, and I don't know why everybody loves that movie. It's so Rosamund Pike's character. I just loathe her. I mean, and you're supposed to, but it's like. Oh, and I think for me it was the ending. The way the movie ended, I'm just like,
I didn't even get to the ending. I just couldn't even
so
get
bad. It's so bad. I mean, people love it, just not me.
Oh God, I didn't like the girl with the dragon tattoo. Not big on Benjamin Button. Yeah, I did like Panic Room. He did Alien.
Panic Room's one of my favorites.
No.
Yeah,
I like
he did
that one.
Alien 3. That was his first movie.
Well, I can forgive that. That wasn't his fault.
Well, the studio interfered far too much with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Suspicion.
So
Suspicion was the first one we did together in 1941. To Catch a Thief came out 14 years later.
Yeah. To Catch a Thief is the third. Is that the third collaboration with Hitchcock? Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, I mean, I get it. I like Cary Grant. He's, for me, it's like actors from that, like Humphrey Bogart's my favorite actor from, that 20, 30 year time span in Hollywood. I like Cary Grant, especially like the stuff he was doing pretty much in the 50s and there forward. It's fine. Like, he's fine. I don't know.
So
He's never been one of my favorite actors.
I hesitate to say this. I don't think Cary Grant is a bad actor, but I do think he kind of did one thing, and that's every character he is in every movie.
That's why I compare him to Tom Cruise. Like, Tom Cruise in the 80s and 90s.
Maybe I just don't watch enough Tom Cruise movies.
What's that?
Said maybe I just don't watch enough Tom Cruise movies. I don't like Tom Cruise. Like,
I don't like Tom Cruise
fan
either.
at all.
I'm not a fan. No, he was great in Rain Man. I like Days of Thunder. Top Gun's fine. It's very hokey 80s movie. Yeah. Jerry Maguire was amazing. A Few Good Men, The Last Samurai, Collateral. But then for me, the moment he jumped on Oprah's couch and like embraced a Scientology thing, I was like, I know it's got nothing to do with him as an actor, but that's when I started just questioning him. Like, what is up with this dude? And then all the movies he's made the last 15 years, he just plays Tom Cruise. He does like he's not like Jerry Maguire was a performance. A Few Good Men was a performance. Where it's like everything he's done for the last movie he performed in to me was Collateral. Everything he's done since then. Yeah, go ahead.
The only one I would say he was like I really took with would be like the one movie where you probably wouldn't even know that was Tom Cruise, which is Interview with a Vampire.
Right. Well, and that's the 90s. I mean, that's when he was still doing acting, when he was still performing in that sense. It's like, and it's the same thing with Will Smith. Like, I don't mind Will Smith, but the last 15 years, it's pretty much, hey, I'm going to see the new Will Smith movie, not I'm going to see this movie that happens to star Will Smith. Like, you're going for the star power, not the film. Go ahead.
I would more compare Cary Grant with maybe more like The Rock, because at least you like the one character he plays. It's like, yeah, it's The Rock. He plays The Rock. I love The Rock. It's Cary Grant. He plays Cary Grant. I love Cary Grant. It's at least likable. It's enjoyable.
That's a great comparison. Cary Grant is or Dwayne The Rock Johnson is the modern day Cary Grant. So, anyways, I'm just so hung up on the Dwayne The Rock Johnson comparison. That's that is so perfect. It's like ridiculous. And then so moving forward, anything that you would like to discuss, we definitely can. I do want to bring up very quickly some of his later films. So, The Birds was his peak, because then you get Marney, which came out to lukewarm reviews. Torn Curtain with Paul Newman and Julie Andrews. Have you ever seen that?
No, I haven't seen anything after The Birds.
They're fine. Topaz is fine. Frenzy I actually really liked because it's like 70s R-rated Hitchcock, if that makes any sense. And then Family Plot, Family Plot was fine. But it's so interesting because I'm looking at his filmography right now, and it's like we're definitely doubling down on the fact that The Birds was the peak of Hitchcock mania, Hitchcock success. But also at the same time, you got to look at the world, So 1963 is The Birds. Well, what happened in 1964? The Beatles came out. They became huge. Music really, and the reason I bring up the Beatles is because society was changing. The way everything was, the movies that came out in the latter part of the 60s and the early 70s, Hollywood was changing. There was just new ways of filmmaking. There were new filmmakers that could dance toe to toe with Hitchcock in terms of how great they were. And, it's almost like he had a great run. I mean, he was doing movies in the 1920s and the 1930s. And it's like pretty much from 1940 starting with Rebecca through The Birds. That's 23 solid years of making excellent films. Does that make, you know what I mean? And
yeah,
that was kind of it. And then it's like the world changed, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the counterculture movement, society just pivoted. And, you never really saw movies with, hippies in them. That Alfred Hitchcock wasn't directing movies with, hippies walking the streets. And does that make sense?
Yeah. Also, he probably wouldn't stand up very well during the age of feminism.
No, not at all. And and you had mentioned Stanley Kubrick. Dr. Strangelove came out in 1964, and it's like you know, and then you get 2001: A Space Odyssey. Like, filmmaking just changed. And then it's like, you know, to think that his last movie came out in 1976, which was the same year as Network and Taxi Driver and Rocky. And it's like, you wouldn't put Alfred Hitchcock's Family Plot up there with those films. It's a fine movie, but cinema itself had just totally changed. And it's not that Hitchcock had, you know, he was like the end all be all to cinema at the time. There were a vast variety of different movies and different filmmakers. But to me, it's just society changed. And that was it, you know.
Oh, no, I was just saying, you did Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
Alfred Hitchcock Presents and Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Those were his two
Well,
series.
I was going to say, the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, that wasn't very long, though, was it? Like, it wasn't long lasting.
You know, here's the deal. So I've not watched either of those shows in a long time. They used to air reruns on TV Land when I was like in elementary school. And it was similar because I would watch reruns of the Twilight Zone and Get Smart and all that stuff. But there's not any episodes specifically that stand out to me that I remember. It was fine. They were entertaining. I've probably seen maybe a dozen or so episodes of either program.
Well, I'm looking on like IMDb because I'm not as familiar. And it says Alfred Hitchcock Hour and only has one episode. And Alfred Hitchcock Presents only has 17.
Yeah,
so the 17 goes from like 1955 to 1961. So it's maybe like 2 or 3 a year. Yeah.
Really? That's interesting. Yeah,
so.
It was never something that I just like dove into. I got when DVDs first kind of like were popular, I got a box set of the best of the Twilight Zone because like that was another one like I just watched random episodes of, and that was interesting. I liked the Twilight Zone, the old ones. There's probably like 10 episodes of that show that are like phenomenal. Like they still I think would stand up today. Like the Burgess Meredith one where he breaks his glasses. It's like the post-apocalypse, you know.
Yeah, I actually absolutely despise the Twilight Zone.
Really? Why?
Yeah.
Why do you despise?
You know, it's one of those things where it's like I like the stories. It's the execution. I can't do it because it's also because these stories are so tropey. It's like I already know what's gonna happen. Just freaking get there already. It's not like they're long either. But I went to see they were showing. Have you ever gone to see any Fathom events in the theater?
Yes, I've seen Rocky and Godfather.
So I go to those a lot because you can definitely put old movies in a theater and make some freaking money. I don't know why they don't do that.
They should do it all the time.
Exactly. I had tickets to see Psycho, but COVID, and my heart is still broken. But that's a whole other story.
It's so funny because that was on my list of things to do last year was go see Psycho at the theater for the anniversary.
Exactly. And I had tickets, and then I got refunded. It was sad. Anyway, so I had gone to see Psycho, or not Psycho. I'd gone to see a couple episodes of The Twilight Zone in the theater, and it was probably one of the worst experiences I've ever had.
What episodes? Like in my life. What episodes did they play? Was it like the one on the airplane, or the one where they think the aliens in the suburbs?
That one. So they did the it's Mulberry Drive or whatever it's called.
Yeah, is that a Ray Bradbury? Is that a Ray Bradbury story? I want to say it is. Keep talking. Let me look it up.
They also did the one where the guy goes to town and he's like back in time or something, and he doesn't realize it. And then lastly, they did this one, and this is the one that was like one of the worst experiences of my life. So I'm one of those people, like, I don't like the sound of like chewing and like sounds kind of like that. Like it really bothered me. Like when people are just making weird noises, I get very agitated. And it was the one where the woman, she's a giant and she's in a cabin and an alien ship lands on her roof, and it turns out it's actually humans and she's the alien, but we thought she was the human the whole time or whatever. But she doesn't speak, nonverbal. And she's just making like weird like noises the whole thing, and I'm just sitting there like vibrating in anger like at my friend for making me go to this. It was like an actual form of torture for me. I couldn't handle it. And ever since, I'm like, I refuse to watch any Twilight Zone. But I was definitely grew up in a household where like every New Year's with the Twilight Zone marathon was on. So it's not like I haven't seen most of it. I've seen most of it, and I just think because I'm from the era that we're from, that I already know these stories intuitively.
I know.
And
it's very cliche.
And they're not told in a way that doesn't lend itself to me being interested and absorbed in it.
Right. By the way,
it does have a great intro, though.
I don't know why the hell I thought Ray Bradbury wrote this, but The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street was written by Rod Serling. That one, and I'm blanking on the titles. That one, the one where the guy's on have you ever seen the Twilight Zone movie that came out in the 80s where they did like 4? So like the remake,
that's a whole big story.
That's a whole nother thing. The remake, the one where John Lithgow's the guy that's on the airplane that sees the alien on the wing or whatever.
Yeah.
That I really like the remake of that, but the original television episode was fine. But like that one, the ones that you just spoke about, those are all ones that I like. And then the one with Burgess Meredith. Did you ever see the one where the kids jump in the swimming pool and it like takes them into a different dimension? That was a good episode. Maybe. That would be one that I would rewatch. But the reason I bring up the Twilight Zone is because at the time, They were, it was kind of, they were similar but yet very different from one another with Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
Mhm.
It's just like same time period, you know what I mean? So, anyways, before we wrap things up, are there any other Hitchcock films that you would like to go over and discuss? Anything that you've got hot takes on? Any final thoughts, Lego?
I don't think I have any hot takes on anything. Well, I guess other than what I've already said, unless you want like an actual dissertation. The
um,
other thing I just kind of wanted to say is, while Hitchcock, didn't show women in a very good light, and while he did do a lot of queer coding, which I find in this day and age very, very problematic, something he did do that I really like that I don't think he gets enough credit for is that he really made you sympathize with the character that was supposed to be the villain, and he tried to make you see that even someone who does something bad isn't necessarily a bad person. Like with Norman Bates, with the character from Strangers on a Train, he always kind of showed them trying, or other people trying to get them help, or them getting help in the end, and he didn't vilify their actions when clearly they weren't necessarily in control of what they were doing, which even today a lot of directors and writers do that, and I think that's very bothersome. So I don't think he gets enough credit for really trying to show people in this sort of non-black and white world.
I couldn't agree more, and you're completely right. And I think what Hitchcock was able to do with Psycho, for example, Psycho, is Norman Bates is mentally ill. He's not
Yeah.
he's not just he's not just some murderer for murdering's sake, because he wants to rob somebody and take their money or something. He's mentally ill. And I think the way it's depicted is done, the execution is perfect because Hitchcock was dealing with a subject that to this day still has a stigma around it. You know what I mean? Like we've made
Yeah.
progress, but this has been a conversation that's been going on. I mean, that movie's 51 years old at this point. Like, how crazy is
Yeah.
that?
Are you familiar with Peeping Tom?
Uh, I mean, like the term, or is that like a
The
film
movie.
as well?
Okay.
No, I've
So,
never seen the movie.
so Psycho is generally credited as being the first slasher film, right?
Sure.
So a lesser known one is Peeping Tom, and it came out the very same year as Psycho, just a few months before. However, it is a British film, and I think a lot of people tend to not understand that when movies came out in the 60s, they came out on actual film, and they literally needed to travel across country from theater to theater. And
Right.
also, international releases didn't mean all over the world. It meant North America and a couple countries in Europe.
Right.
So while Peeping Tom technically came out before Psycho, it wasn't released in the US until probably early 1962. But
Okay.
Peeping Tom and Psycho are basically the same movie. And I actually think Peeping Tom is the superior movie. It's about
Really?
Peeping Tom is about a young man who I, he wants to be a filmmaker. Like Norman Bates, he's a voyeur who is very mentally ill, and we are watching it from his perspective rather than from other people's. And they're really similar. They have a lot of the same things being hit. They're
Mhm.
both really good. I remember Peeping Tom being in color, but I might be wrong about that. I'm not sure like how England rules were different because they didn't have the Hays Code like the US did. So I'm not sure like what
Mhm.
they were allowed to do versus not. But yeah, in terms of like film history, I think it's definitely something that needs to be mentioned along with Psycho. And you have like those little people who want to hit semantics when you call Psycho the first slasher and think, oh well, actually, it's Peeping Tom. It's kind of the same thing with Black Christmas versus Halloween. But
Oh,
yeah,
Black Christmas is so great. We will definitely have to do it. Well, that's its own show. So I'm looking
oh my
online
gosh,
right
yeah.
now. Peeping Tom is in color. You're correct. It came out in 1960, but wasn't released here until 1962. It's a Criterion Collection movie film.
Oh.
Uh, It's got a 93 or 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. So definitely
I mean,
gonna have to
it's
check
a
that out.
good movie.
Anyways, so this was our discussion on Alfred Hitchcock. Thank you all
Yes.
for joining us.